Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to today's episode. I got a good one for you today. Let's see if you can guess what it is. It's not a well known artist. Instead, today I picked a soundtrack, and it's the only soundtrack of its kind. Can you guess which one I'm talking about? Stick around because I'll tell you all about it and more in today's episode of Vinyl Tales. Okay, everyone, picture this May 25th, 1977. A new movie is released into a small number of theaters, and it instantly becomes a so called blockbuster hit. So it is very quickly given a much wider release across the country. This new movie is, of course, called Star Wars. Later, it was renamed Star Wars 4 A New Hope. Now, since its release, it has grown to be known as one of the greatest and most influential films of all time. And the soundtrack was written and composed by none other than one of the greatest soundtrack composers of our time, John Williams. Now, in March of 1977, with the movie having come out in May, over the span of 12 days, even though they're only actually in the studio 8 of those days, over the span of a 12-day period at Anvil Studios in Denham, England, John Williams and the orchestra there in London got together and they recorded the soundtrack for this album right there in London. Now, this soundtrack, as I said in the intro, is the only one of its kind. And so, to prove to you, let's get into the real fun details, why don't we? Now, first thing, did you know this soundtrack almost didn't happen as it is? Well, it was released as a dual LP in June of 1977, meaning it's got 2 records inside it instead of just simply one, like most albums do. Now, originally for the film, because the film takes place in so-called alien worlds, George Lucas thought that it would be a good idea to use pre-existing music for the soundtrack instead of coming up with something entirely new specifically for the movie. And so he chose some songs and he hired John Williams as simply a music consultant at first. And so John Williams came in and he looked at the songs that George Lucas had chosen for the movie and he decided that an original soundtrack would be a much better option. So he convinced George Lucas that an original soundtrack would be better than pre-existing ones. And so George Lucas looked at John Williams and he said, well, then you write it. And so he challenged John Williams to compose the soundtrack for Star Wars by himself. And man, did he. Now, to help out with it, John Williams, for some of the songs that he wrote for the movie, took inspiration from some of the pre-existing ones that George Lucas had originally picked. For instance, the main title theme, as it's called, drew inspiration from a film called King's Row from 1942. And the song Dune Sea of Tatooine actually drew inspiration from an Italian film from 1948. The original name is in Italian, so it can be interpreted either Bicycle Thieves or The Bicycle Thief, depending on which translation you want to use. But It was that movie that gave some influence for the song Dune Sea of Tatooine. So eventually, later, after the movie came out and the soundtrack came out and they both became big successes, George Lucas denied ever having even considered using pre-existing music for the soundtrack. However, whether he considered using it or didn't, the fact is the soundtrack for this movie was pretty great all around. So I think John Williams did a pretty good job, don't you? Now let's get into the reason why this is the only soundtrack of its kind. Now, this soundtrack album here, the original soundtrack to Star Wars, before it was renamed Star Wars 4, this one that came out in 1977 is the only soundtrack of its kind because it's the only Star Wars soundtrack to be released by the film distributor's own record label. So, the people that released and distributed the movie also distributed the record. 20th Century Fox was responsible for both. And it says so on the jacket, and it says so on the label itself. 20th Century Fox. Now, let me get into why it's like that. Now, you got to remember, June of 1977, this soundtrack comes out for the movie, and it's this great big hit. So, of course, they're going to reissue it, and it's since been reissued multiple times, gathering many accolades and awards over the course of its lifetime. However, the first two, there's an original release in 1977 and a reissue that came out a year later in about 1978, that are the only two that have the record label 20th Century Fox Records on them. Because in 1981, it ended. I'll get more into that in a minute. Well, the reissue in 1978 has a different label variant. What it is it's got that 20th Century Fox statue that they've got in all of their movies with the spotlights going everywhere and the sky all lit up. That's the majority of the label for the reissue from 78. Now, if you've got a genuine first pressing like I'd have here, the label is a light blue label, and I'll get it out quick for you so you can see what it actually looks like. The label is a light blue label that says, instead of 20th Century Fox Records, it actually says 20th Century Records, as you can see right there on the inner sleeve. Because they changed the name in 1978. Here's what the label looks like, so you can see what it actually looks like. Now it's got that light blue label with a little bit of purple on the bottom and a multicolored 20th Century Records logo at the top of the label. That's the original release, the first release that you want to be on the lookout for if you want to get one of these like I have. Now, let's get into why it's the only one of its kind for the Star Wars. 20th Century Fox Records had two runs initially. It originally started in 1958, known as just simply 20th Fox. Now, in 1963, it was renamed to match the name of the parent company that owned it. And so it became 20th Century Fox Records in 1963. And it eventually closed down in 1970, making it the end of the first run. So we've got 1958 when it was originally opened, the name change in 1963, and then we have the end of the first run in 1970 when it closed for the first time. Now, 2 years later in 1972, they reopened it. 20th Century Fox reopened the recording studio. And it was reopened as 20th Century Records, like it says right here on this album. 20th Century Records, not 20th Century Fox Records. And that's the name that it went by when it released this in 1977. Now, the reason that there's a different label and a different name for the reissue from 1978, 79, depending on where you look, is because in 1978, a year after this one was released, they changed the name again. Once again, so that it would match the name of parent company that owned it. So it became 20th Century Fox Records once again. And it remained that until it closed down in 1981. Now, even though the sequel to this movie was released in 1980, the soundtrack to the second one was actually outsourced to RSO. And RSO is the name on the record label that released the soundtrack for that one, not 20th Century Fox Records, even though they technically were still open. Because in about 1980, eventually leading to a complete closure in 1981. About 1980, they were starting to undergo financial problems with the record label. And so, instead of using the record label to make all of the rest of their releases up until the final closure, they were starting to outsource their soundtracks to other labels like RSO to be made there instead, since they were dealing with financial difficulties in their own label, which would eventually lead to a complete closure in 81, and no more Star Wars soundtracks would ever be made on the same label that made the first one. And it was revived in the late 90s, but that's not really the same thing. It's just kind of like a name that's being used. And so, since the record label no longer existed, we've got First Run. First opened in 1958, name change 1 in 63, end of the first run in 1970. It was reopened in 72 with name change number 2. The album was released in 1977, name change in 78, with a final closing in 1981. So now we've got a timeline. Of course, I've explained why this is the only soundtrack of its kind, but there's actually one more thing that I want to tell you about before we get all done here. So, here we go. Now, sadly, the last thing I want to talk to you about, mine doesn't actually have, because it didn't come with it, but I'll put a picture of it up on the screen for y'all to see, so you can see what it looks like anyway. But, if you have an original release of this album, like what I have right here, the original release was actually released with an insert, a bonus insert. What it is this insert is a poster, but what they did was they had a sci-fi artist, this well-known sci-fi artist, take a scene from the end of the movie where they're battling in space above the Death Star. This sci-fi artist took a scene from that battle, that space battle, and he painted it. And what they did was they took his painting and they turned it into a picture and released it as this bonus poster inside the album. And so, when people back in 1977 were buying this album, they'd grab it, they'd open it up, and they'd pull the record out, wanting to listen to the record, and it was out with the record would fall this bonus poster of a scene, a painted scene from the end of the movie. And so, like I said, sadly, mine didn't actually come with the poster. But the poster looks pretty cool. And to me, that just means I'll have to find me another one that does have a poster. because you got to have the full set. You can't just stop partway through. But I hope y'all enjoyed listening to this episode. I thought it was quite interesting. Please let me know down below what you thought. If you got any ideas of any other albums or songs that got a cool story or something behind them that most people may or may not know, what would actually be kind of interesting, just let me know down below, and when I get a chance, I'll see about looking them up. Who knows? They might actually appear in a future episode. So just please let me know in the comments what you thought. If you got any ideas for other things to talk about, other albums, other songs to talk about that may have a cool story, I got a whole bunch lined up for you. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one. I'm Brandon, and this is Vinyl Tales, where we spin tales about vinyl.